We're marching along through history, looking at our some of our more interesting presidential races. This morning, our speaker is David Price. Now, David grew up in Eastern Tennessee, got his bachelor's at Memphis State, then a master's in political science at Georgia, and a PhD from the University of Miami in history. So in his dissertation, he focused, his PhD dissertation, he focused very much on the Truman administration, particularly as Truman related to Congress. Right after the war, world trade was a big issue, trying to sort out how the world was going to operate after the war. And so it was a very interesting period. So he knows Truman and he knows the Truman administration. David came to Santa Fe as a professor in 2000, and he's been very active on campus, served for 10 years as chair of the faculty senate at Santa Fe. So he's not only been teaching, but he's been working, managing the relationship between the administration and the faculty. He's also been pretty active in the community, and as a matter of fact, is currently serving as elections analyst for WCJB TV. That's Channel 7 for those of you who are on Cox. And on election night, he'll be there on screen with commentary and analysis as the votes are coming in. So he'll be working another election, but now we're going back to 1948. David Price, welcome him.
Thank you all. My PhD alma mater would certainly consider me remiss if I didn't point out that it's Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, not the University of Miami down in Coral Gables. Okay. How about now? All right. All right. And I'll use my auditorium voice. Is that better? All right. Good. Want to just jump right into the election because there's a lot of stuff to talk about with it. There were three main issues in the political environment in 1948. One of them, yes, thank you. One was the fair deal versus the 80th Congress. And the issue there was President Roosevelt had outlined a bold vision for what America was fighting for in his State of the Union address in 1944 called the Economic Bill of Rights. And he intended to expand the New Deal into this broader vision. And people who were opposed to the New Deal were fighting him on it, or fighting Truman on it. Another issue is civil rights. Lots of people were calling for dismantling Jim Crow system, and there were other voices, especially in the South, calling to retain the Jim Crow system. And then there was the issue of Soviet expansion or communist expansion. There was still a good bit of isolationist sentiment in the US at that time. So that was also a major dividing line in politics. In terms of what the fair deal versus the 80th Congress meant, one of the parts of the Economic Bill of Rights had been that people should have a right to a job. And President Truman had proposed that in what was called the Full Employment Bill. Also, he had called for national public housing, fulfilling Roosevelt's call for the right to decent housing for all Americans. And lastly, national health insurance, the right to health care, still a debate. And a 75-cent an hour minimum wage. Anybody remember what the minimum wage was in 1948? Actually, it had gone up to 40. It was originally 25 cents and it went staggered up to 40. So that's nearly doubling it, which would be kind of the equivalent of going to $14.50 an hour now, which of course in Florida in a couple of years we will be past. Kind of the opposite Truman's nemesis on this was the 80th Congress that had been elected in 1946. It was a majority Republican Congress for the first time since 1932. And it had been elected under the slogan, "Had enough," which Republican factions kind of interpreted differently for their own means. Its biggest accomplishment had been the Taft-Hartley Act, which significantly reduced the power of unions, primarily or kind of most obviously by outlawing closed shops unless the state allowed closed shops. Truman called it the Do-Nothing 80th Congress because it had rejected all of the fair deal. Yeah. In regard to civil rights, progress was being made outside of the federal government, which was really starting to shake up segregationists. In the beginning of the spring 1947, as you probably recall, Jackie Robinson desegregated baseball. President Truman, kind of along the same time, called for abolishing poll taxes, a federal anti-lynching law, military desegregation, and a Fair Employment Practices Commission that would actually have even more power than it had had during World War II to keep discrimination against African Americans from occurring in employment. Just out of curiosity, does anybody know when that federal anti-lynching law passed? 2021. Containing Soviet expansion was more bipartisan than the other issues. And a lot had been done in that regard. 1947, aid to Greece and Turkey had been passed. The CIA and some other agencies were created by the National Security Act. The Marshall Plan had been passed, all of which, by the way, was done by the 80th Congress. So that's an issue that does rear its head, but it was something that was less divisive among the parties. In terms of who was wanting to be president on the Republican side, you had the 1944 nominee, New York Governor Thomas Dewey. He wanted to contain the Soviets, wanted to maintain the New Deal rather than repeal it, and didn't oppose civil rights reform. His big opponent was Senator Robert Taft from Ohio, the son of former President William Howard Taft. He was very sympathetic to isolationism. He had already started dismantling the New Deal, the Taft-Hartley Act. He's the Taft in the sponsors of that. And his campaign literature overtly said he was running for president so that the next Congress could finish what the 80th Congress started and dismantle the New Deal. A perennial candidate eventually, I believe this might have been his first effort, governor of Minnesota at the time, Harold Stassen. He was the most liberal of the contenders for the Republican nomination, and he was actually described as a progressive. In our day, it's kind of hard to imagine a Republican being described as a progressive. And certainly no Republican would embrace that description today. Stassen embraced it. Then there was the governor of California, Earl Warren. He also advocated containing the Soviets and maintaining the New Deal, not repealing it. And he wasn't formally running. But if you read the newsletters that organizations put out and the analysis that was being done, he was talked about as who the Republican Party would turn to if Dewey and Taft deadlocked at the convention. Because this was actually a time when the convention was not just a foregone conclusion with kind of a coronation. It actually mattered. Although party bosses did tend to have a big say into which delegates went. But once there, the delegates did have more freedom of choice than they do today. Well, Dewey and Warren win, although it took 4 ballots. Taft increasingly got less and less support with each ballot, and on the 4th ballot, Taft formally withdrew and Dewey was nominated unanimously. He had the support of the Republican establishment, which kind of ultimately is what prevailed. It was not a bad choice from a lot of strategic perspectives. New York at that time had the most electoral votes, 47, was the most populous state. And he had kind of a good resume for president. He was the prosecutor who put away Lucky Luciano. He was the governor of the most populous state. Sure, he had lost, but it was the middle of the war. You can kind of forgive a loss under that circumstance. So people were very optimistic on the Republican side. Warren provided geographic balance, but no policy balance. Warren and Dewey were very much in lockstep policy-wise. Their victory, however, is significant in American political history because it really is, up until 2016, the defeat of isolationism within the Republican Party. And also really the defeat until 1994 of appeals to try to destroy the New Deal in the Republican Party. Sure, there might have been Republicans saying these things, but they weren't winning until 1994 with the New Deal and in 2016 with Donald Trump and isolationism. Aside from the apparent strengths of Dewey's candidacy, there was a lot of problems with Truman. He was derisively referred to by many of his critics as his accidency. Ooh, wow. You know, ordinarily, it's not hard for an incumbent president to get renominated, even if later on they do have to give up the nomination. Truman was blamed for the Democratic defeat in 1946 by lots of party leaders. Yeah, I wasn't aware that the PowerPoint had the sound effect on it. Democrats lost 13 Senate seats and 56 House seats in that election, and control of Congress. Yeah, I think this is okay. Progressives thought that Truman was too hawkish in containing Soviet expansion. He wasn't giving peace a chance, to quote a later songwriter, and that he had bungled passage of the fair deal. Although with the 80th Congress, passage of the fair deal was going to be not really an even starting conversation. Segregationist Southern Democrats saw him as too liberal because he's promoting integration. And I think this cartoon really captures the balancing act that Truman had to do. And if those extreme people on the left and on the right had been as large as they are illustrated on that cartoon, it wouldn't have worked. But lots of Democrats were in that center. But still, it was looking like a real challenge for Truman to win re-election. Some party leaders had tried to draft Dwight Eisenhower to run instead of Truman, especially a newly formed group called Americans for Democratic Action. These were people who wanted to see the New Deal expanded, but also wanted strong anti-communist policies. Eisenhower kind of toyed with them, but then eventually declared that he was a Republican and could not in good conscience accept the Democratic nomination. At the convention, the biggest issue was the platform fight over civil rights. Progressives and kind of the anti-Soviet liberals, led by a Senate candidate, the mayor of Minneapolis, Hubert Humphrey, really wanted to move the party beyond just generalized civil rights rhetoric and wanted the specific proposals that Truman had endorsed put in the Democratic Party platform. Southern segregationists were not having that. There was a bitter platform fight. But when the votes were held, Humphrey and the Forces for Civil Rights and Integration won. And the delegation of Mississippi and half of the delegation of Alabama stormed out of the convention in really dramatic fashion. Truman is nominated, which not really kind of in doubt. And within 2 weeks, he had issued Executive Order 9981, which ended segregation in the U.S. military, fulfilling one of the proposals he had argued for, and that was part of the Democratic Party's platform at that point. What that does is it sets up a four-way general election. The two mainstream parties, we've already kind of covered who their candidates were. Want to kind of go back and hit what their stances on the main issues of the day were. Truman and the Democrats, they scaled back some of the more intense parts of the fair deal, but they were still pushing, expand the New Deal toward the Economic Bill of Rights. Maybe not all the way to it yet, but toward it. Clearly make the New Deal do more for the American people. Dewey wanted to keep the New Deal. Didn't want any more of the New Deal taken away, but wasn't real keen on seeing it expanded. Dewey also called for containing communism and the Republican Party platform echoes the Democratic Party platform on civil rights. What's the difference? I mean, a lot less than you see today between the two party platforms. I mean, yeah, what should happen to the New Deal is different. But there's not a lot of policy difference on other issues. Truman's got to make a case for why you should vote for him over Dewey. And what he does, he doesn't run his campaign against Dewey. He runs his campaign against the 80th Congress. And there's a really good clip from James Whitmore's Give 'Em Hell, Harry, which was part of this movement in the early 1970s of famous actors doing monologues of famous historical figures. And I want us to watch a couple of minutes of that if the technology cooperates, because it really shows how Truman is not running against Dewey. Truman is running against the 80th Congress. Yep, escape and then go to the, I believe it's the Google tab. Yep. And then play on the far, yep.
We've got to move on, but before we do, may I say this to you? In parting, I want to pay tribute, very sincere tribute, to the great liberal spirit of this great state of Minnesota. And you know better than I do where that spirit derives from. It derives from a very simple word: faith. Faith first in yourselves, then in each other, and finally faith in this great country of ours. And you know, my friends, that is the kind of faith that the Republican Party simply cannot understand. I know, because I've been viewing that political party from close to for a number of years, and by golly, they won't tell you what they really believe in. I know they got a platform, doesn't mean a thing. They won't tell you, but by golly, I'm going to try to tell you what the Republican Party really does believe in. Now, they say, for example, that they have faith in the American farmer. Sure, but they're willing to let him go broke. And they say they have faith in the American home, but not public housing. And they say in their platform, if you want to read it, it's funny reading, read it. It says in the platform they want to extend Social Security benefits to more Americans. It says it right in there. And yet the 80th Republican Congress just took Social Security benefits away from 750,000 Americans. Now, do they really believe? The American people are so foolish they're going to believe poppycock like that. And they say, of course, they're for a minimum wage. You bet they are. The more minimum earned, the better. And of course, they say that they believe in the American way of life. You bet they do, just as long as it doesn't spread to all the folks. And they say, of course, that they admire the American government. You bet they do. They admire the American government so much they want to buy it. But by golly, we're going to tell them on election day that it's not for sale. Not now, never will be, never, ever, at any price. But no, mister, I don't give them hell. I just tell the truth on them, and that makes them feel like they're in hell. But say, ma'am, I'm sorry. How do I feel about speech making? Well, I feel very much.
Did he mention Thomas Dewey? Did he mention the 80th Congress? That's really important. And slideshow, current slide. Yep. Yep. And then to make it interesting, there were two other candidates that were well positioned to get votes, not only popular votes, but electoral votes. The Progressive Party nominated former Roosevelt Vice President Henry Wallace. For Wallace, not only was there great disappointment in the direction that Truman had taken the country, there was a little bit of personal animosity and jealousy because Wallace had been Roosevelt's vice president up until the Democratic Convention of 1944, when conservative Democrats had forced Roosevelt to dump him and replace him with Truman. Had that not happened, Henry Wallace would be the incumbent president. And he knew that. And he felt and lived that every day. He wants to beat Truman. And the Progressive Party really came up with alternatives in everything that the Democrats wanted. They wanted full bore go on to make the Economic Bill of Rights be what the New Deal was. They wanted to not contain Soviet expansion, but to repair the relationship with the Soviet Union. Wallace was still a believer that we could be the allies who had defeated fascism. Wallace went so far as to call for all countries to work through the UN to achieve global disarmament. And as for civil rights, more than the other two parties, if you read the Progressive Party platform, they realize that there's discrimination beyond African Americans. They overtly call for civil rights for Spanish speakers. Didn't use the word Hispanic back then. And all ethnic groups. And they wanted greater federal action to do those things. So they are presenting a clear alternative to the Democratic Party for people left of the political spectrum. And in a close election, that third party siphoning votes off can decide it. The segregationists also ran a candidate. They had actually nominated Georgia Senator Richard Russell at the Democratic Convention. He had no chance. Russell decides he's still a Democrat and doesn't want to be nominated by a third party. However, South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond was more than happy to accept the nomination of what was formerly known as the States' Rights Party. The media dubbed it the Dixiecrats because they were all conservative Southern Democrats. They had a very small platform. It'll fit on a page. And contrary to what Trent Lott said at Strom Thurmond's 100th birthday party as he was retiring from the U.S. Senate, it was totally just about segregation. It overtly calls for protection of segregation and demands that there be no police state to force people to associate with people they didn't want to associate with. There is nothing in the Progressive Party platform that overtly addresses any New Deal program or the issue of Soviet expansion. It was purely a party of segregation. Well, when the votes are counted, Truman wins re-election, and he wins it pretty handily. I don't know if you can see probably in the back the electoral vote totals there. Truman won 303 electoral votes, just a little under what President Biden won. Thurmond wins 39 electoral votes from Southern states. including one from a faithless elector in Tennessee. Truman handily won the popular vote as well. And this really stuns Republicans. Truman got 24.1 million votes. Dewey got a little under 22 million votes. If you do that percentage-wise out of the votes cast, Truman got 57% of the vote. Wallace got 1.1 million votes. So, which totaled 2.4% of the vote. You add those together, left of center candidates got 60% of the vote in that election. And that is perhaps the high point in the post-war era of left of center politicians getting that. 1964 might have come close to that. Even more importantly, the Democrats pick up 9 seats in the U.S. Senate and a whopping 75 seats in the House of Representatives, regaining control of Congress, and not by a razor-thin margin like we see today, by a substantial margin. So this is an overwhelming victory. And one of the things that I was toying along with writing an article, and probably would have had I ended up at an institution where publishing was required, was why, there are a lot of parallels between the late 1940s and the mid 1990s politically. Bill Clinton oversaw the Democrats losing control of the House of Representatives and the Senate to the Contract with America movement from the Republicans. He's able to beat them back and regain and keep the presidency in 1996, but he's not able to capture the House and the Senate for the Democrats again, the way Truman was able to do that. Clinton had his own third party to contend with, although it was kind of a mismatch of kind of incoherent ideologies. Something to kind of think about in terms of comparative political eras. Why did Truman win? And that was certainly a question that lots of Republicans asked. Basically, running against the 80th Congress worked. Especially with key groups, farmers, unionized workers, civil rights supporters. The Taft-Hartley Act really alienated the union movement. And a lot of union voters, while they may have been attracted to Henry Wallace's messages, between fear of Soviet expansion and recognizing that the Truman administration was going to protect the rights of workers that were obtained in the New Deal, basically went ahead and rejected the temptation to vote for Wallace and supported Truman. When Republicans looked at the election, they complained that Dewey didn't do anything to defend the 80th Congress. I think that if he had, probably would have lost even worse. And certainly had Robert Taft of the Taft-Hartley Act been running, definitely would have lost even worse. But Also, Dewey was overconfident. He campaigned very little the last 2 weeks of the election. He only made one large-scale public speech the week before the election. And he ran kind of a lackluster campaign. One of the documents that I came across as I was writing my dissertation was from a longtime Republican politician. He was kind of, I guess, more middle of his career at this point, but he is in politics and through the, I believe, the early 70s. Frank Case, he's eventually a senator. At this point, he's still just a member of the U.S. House. He writes to Joe Martin, who was the Speaker of the House in the 80th Congress. And I love some of the quotes as he's analyzing Dewey's campaign. Dewey's speeches were an eloquent way to say nothing. Dewey said the big issue was unity. That's like saying the big issue is the Star-Spangled Banner or the Lord's Prayer. It's not controversial. It doesn't distinguish you. Dewey constantly gave the impression of being superior, of talking down to his audience, of looking smarty. So, overconfidence, poor campaigning, that's kind of the analysis from Republicans of why they lost. They eventually do get that the New Deal is popular. And it takes a whole lot and a lot of time and a lot of people who lived through the Depression no longer being voters before the New Deal can be undone. And even then, key parts of it, like Social Security, are still in good shape in terms of policy support among the American public. But that's for a different election. So what questions does anybody have?
Thank you, David. That was really well done.
Thank you. Well, this was really interesting considering what we're going through in our election campaigns now. I'd be interested in knowing, I know polling wasn't as well developed then as it is now, but I wonder if in the election, well, let me back up. We often say that, in a crisis, especially a national crisis involving foreign actors, that we want to stay with the horse we rode in on. But I wonder if in the polls or any other source that foreign policy had a big influence on Truman winning.
Polling was, as you're saying, not as developed as it is today. And my memory is people were so sure that the split in the Democratic Party was going to doom Truman that they quit polling about the time Dewey kind of quit campaigning, about 2 weeks before the election, which is why you have the famous headline shot of Dewey defeats Truman that Truman is holding up that I didn't show because everybody's seen it. And I don't think that there was a lot of polling that drilled down so that you could effectively make a generalization about the role of foreign policy. I'll be honest, I can't say that I've looked in depth at the polls that were taken in 1948. 1949 would have been a very different year in terms of the effect of foreign policy. The Marshall Plan had been implemented in the spring, or had been passed in the spring of 1948 in the wake of a coup overthrowing a coalition government in Czechoslovakia and installing a communist government. But by the fall, a lot of memories of that had kind of faded. If the election had been in the fall of 1949, however, two events happened that scared the hell out of the American public. The Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb, and Mao Zedong announces from Tiananmen Square the formation of the People's Republic of China, putting a fourth of the world's population under communism. So that's about all I can say about foreign policy in the 1948 election.
Yeah, yes, good morning. Enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is about Harry Truman, but is not about the election of Harry Truman. So I'd like to share it with the audience. It's a document I have in my hand with his signature dated May 14, 1948, approved. This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority in the new state of Israel. And that's dated May 14, 1948. And this was done in the United Nations, and the United States was the first country to recognize the state of Israel. Thank you.
Yep.
The comment about Dewey talking down to the public and being smarty reminded me of my only meeting with Dewey. Two of my law classmates were junior associates with his firm, and I had gone down to the Wall Street area to have lunch with them. And the three of us were in the elevator, and we were going out to lunch. And Dewey got in the elevator and looked him up and down and said, well, I assume you're dining in since you're not wearing hats.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another part of Case's letter to Joe Martin mentioned that he thought Dewey should have shaved his mustache. He lost lots of female voters because of the mustache.
So I was fascinated looking at the map with the electoral votes and how few Florida had in 1948, just almost an insignificant state.
Yeah, 8.
Yeah. Other quick question, you made repetitive references to union and appeals to union and union vote, which is amazing considering how politically impotent unions are today. Do you have any idea what the percentage of American workers were union workers back in 1948? Because apparently it was very significant in the election.
I don't know off the top of my head, like an exact percentage. I do know that union membership peaked in the 1950s as a percentage of the workforce and has been on the decline significantly since the 1970s. For a variety of factors. And it is, I think, very telling. Not only is the power of the union movement in numbers diminished, the unions themselves, at least some of them, notably, was it the Teamsters that failed to make an endorsement in this election cycle? I mean, that would have been unheard of under Jimmy Hoffa. Not that I'm proclaiming that we should get back to the Hoffa style union leadership, but no endorsement. Um, the union movement as a political force is, as you're saying, greatly diminished. It does seem to be coming back as an economic force to improve the lives of the workers who are unionized. But increasingly, I think in part because of Taft-Hartley, the Wagner Act had required businesses to make employees that the Wagner Act had required if a business had a union, all workers had to join the union. They could opt out after a certain point. The Taft-Hartley Act removed that. And that's the issue of a closed shop or open shop state. And there were several states that had passed closed shop state legislation during the Depression about the same time, or maybe even a little before the Wagner Act. Those are still closed shop states in many cases. Almost no state passes a closed shop rule after the Taft-Hartley Act. And that really hurt expansion of unions into other areas. And today, that's a big issue. I will point out, there have been periods of American history since the Taft-Hartley Act was passed where there were congressional majorities of Democrats who could have repealed it under Democratic presidents, and for whatever reason, they did not. One of them being the 81st Congress. Another, the Congress elected in Lyndon Johnson's shellacking of Barry Goldwater in 1964. For whatever reason, even though it's been part of the Democratic Party's platform many times, when Democrats have had the numbers to do it, they have not repealed the Taft-Hartley Act, which
We have one question, David, on Zoom. And Rick Gold is asking, could you talk about the role of the Soviet Union in supporting the Wallace campaign and its implications? And its implications for the Cold War and the progressive movement.
I mean, the Soviet Union, like the United States at the time, interfered in other countries' elections. My favorite story of the U.S. doing that is the organization that was between the OSS and the CIA printed up a bunch of bumper stickers for the Christian Democratic Party of Italy, trying to influence the election, but not having the analysts to tell them that most Italians don't drive cars. 1940s. So yes, the Soviet Union did support Henry Wallace covertly. Joe McCarthy makes some hay out of that, exaggerated hay, as all of his hay was. It definitely hurt Henry Wallace's reputation. And there were, I think the progressive movement overall began to kind of splinter on issues as the Cold War intensified. And the association of progressivism, which perhaps is what is being suggested by the question, the association of progressivism with support for the Soviet Union or being a fifth column for the Soviet Union probably cuts into some appeal of the progressive movement in the United States. But people who had been members of the progressive movement were able to channel those energies into effective policy change like the Civil Rights Act and progress on civil rights issues. And it's really, in history, we talk about Thermidorian reactions dating back to the French Revolution. And the 1960s saw a Thermidorian reaction against progressivism in the US that had larger causes than the Soviet association with especially specific progressive leaders. It hurt them as politicians, but I think that it was part of a multiplicity of factors, and in and of itself didn't doom progressivism in the United States. It was one of several factors that eventually cut into it and gave us Richard Nixon, which I noticed was not one of the races that.
Another question on chat said, were taxes an issue then? The top income brackets were taxed at a huge percentage rates. I don't know.
There are always promises to lower taxes, especially from Republicans. One thing to keep in mind when comparing tax rates then and now is we have fewer tax rates now. The top tax rate in the post-World War II environment up until the reforms in the 1980s, or deforms, depending on your perspective, hit a lot fewer Americans. When you hear about rates of 80, 90%, a lot less of the population paid that than pay the current 37%. So there was talk about lowering tax rates, but it was not nearly as serious as expanding Social Security or tightening up on eligibility of Social Security. It was more about what the money was going to be spent on than we're going to really change the tax system in a fundamental way, the way that we're seeing some proposals in this system, in this election. And as primarily a researcher of trade policy, I mean, it boggles my mind that Donald Trump is talking about going back to the 1890s and funding the federal government primarily by a tariff. If there is sufficient revenue raised from a tariff to fund the federal government, prices will be insane. We'll want the 9.2 inflation rate of 2022.
And this has really been enjoyable. Any other questions for David? Yes.
It hits me that's an interesting comment about the taxes and your comment about today with Trump. Clearly, Trump is a firm believer in correcting the trade imbalance. And that's driving a lot of his support, I think, for tariffs, because he thinks that might reverse it. If you tie that in with the union trends, he misunderstands a lot in those relationships. I mean, and they're directly related in the sense that if you're a union guy, you want to fix the trade imbalance. And he's missing that the economy has moved more to a service economy, and people aren't building things anymore. So,
yeah, there is definitely a lot that the former president gets confused about. And it's hard to identify the American product anymore. And the notion that you
Hold that
can,
down for me as I'm reading.
the notion that you can just tax imports to save jobs is even less true than it was in the 1940s. You know, I mean, at what point is it an American car? Is it an American car because the final assembly point is in Detroit when the components were all made in other countries? I mean, it's really bizarre. And it'll be interesting to see what happens.
One more question on the chat says, Truman recognized Israel despite opposition from the American establishment, and especially the well-known anti-Semitism of the State Department. Why didn't he cave into them?
That's a really good question. And there are answers that are related to Truman personally. He had a close personal friend, and I'm drawing a blank on his last name. His first name was Eddie, that really lobbied him personally, would go to the White House and, you know, really push Truman to push the UN, to push Britain to grant sovereignty to at least part of Palestine for Israel. There were other factors as well that probably muted some of the State Department. You mentioned that the U.S. was the first country to recognize Israel. My understanding was actually that the Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Israel, and that the Soviets were very supportive of Israel as part of their overall decolonization, get the Western powers out, liberate the peoples of the world. And if the Soviet Union is doing something, we kind of have to do it too, or we start to not look like we're on the side of good. Certainly there's still anti-Semitism today, and there was clearly anti-Semitism in the 1940s, but because of the Holocaust and the images that people had seen in the theaters, on the newsreels and things like that, it was increasingly something you didn't really want to say out loud. Sadly, it does seem that in certain quarters that is faded. But I do believe that Cold War dynamics had also something to do with why Truman was able to tell the State Department, we want to recognize Israel. We don't want to be, in the eyes of the world, the superpower that doesn't recognize Israel. And remember, a lot of the early Israeli independence fighters were part of a political movement known as Histadrut, which was a definitely left of center, not quite communist, but, you know, I mean, the idea of kibbutz and a less market dynamic driven way of life and things like that. The Soviets tried to make a lot of propaganda as, you know, being their model of collectivization. Wasn't, but I mean, there was some purpose there.
Well, thank you for a very, very enjoyable hour. Next week, Tim Wald will come back to talk about the election of 1896 and William Jennings Bryan. And then our final lecture, because of the change in schedules, because of the storms. David is coming back on November 13th. That'll be, the semester ends on October 30th, and we skip a week. This is because we got to find rooms. But we found a room for David on November 13th to talk about Gore versus Bush. 2000. See you then. Thanks.
Thank you all.